I had always been proud of the work I had put into building my startup. The long hours, sleepless nights, and endless decisions, they had all been worth it when I saw our company growing, gaining recognition, and attracting clients who believed in what we were doing. We had created something special, something I had dreamed of for years. The world was just beginning to notice. But as I look back now, I realize how quickly things can unravel. It didn't happen all at once, but rather it crept up slowly. First, there were the unexpected costs. There was always something, a new software, a vital hire, a marketing campaign that required more money than we had initially budgeted for. We were a young company and every penny mattered, but we were managing, or so I thought. I kept pushing for more, kept telling myself that we just needed to get through the next quarter, the next round of funding. I kept convincing myself that if I could just make it through this one challenge, we would be fine. But deep down, I felt the pressure mounting, the weight of it all slowly crushing me. The constant balancing act of managing payroll, paying the bills, and securing new investments was taking its toll on me, mentally and physically. Then the investors began to question everything. The numbers weren't as promising as they had hoped. The growth was slower than anticipated. And the worst part, I couldn't tell them that it would get better because honestly I wasn't sure it would. The walls were closing in. It was during one of those late nights, when I sat alone in my office staring at the mountain of unpaid invoices, that I got the call. The call that would change everything. It was from the bank. They told me that the loans I had taken out to keep the company afloat were nearing default. They couldn't extend any more credit. It was the kind of call you hope you'll never receive. I remember my hand shaking as I put the phone down, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. The realization hit me like a truck. It was over. I had failed. All the plans, all the hard work, it wasn't enough. And now it was slipping through my fingers. I knew what I had to do next. The only thing that made sense was to sell the company. It wasn't something I wanted to do, but I didn't see any other way out. The thought of giving up everything I had worked so hard for hurt more than I could put into words. But the alternatives were worse. I couldn't face the shame of failing completely. I sold off shares, most of them. The biggest sacrifice of all was selling a large portion of the company's stock to a private investor. They took control, but in return, they gave me just enough to clear the debts and save my personal finances. It was a bitter pill to swallow. The company I had built from the ground up was no longer mine. I had handed it over, and with it, all the hopes I had for its future. I tried to go on with my life after that. I tried to rebuild myself, to find something else that would bring me purpose. But the truth was I felt hollow, empty. I had poured everything I had into this dream, and now it was gone. Every time I saw an article about a startup making it big, I couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy, followed by the harsh reminder of my own failure. The hardest part of all was facing the people I had let down. My employees, many of whom had trusted me to lead them to success. My investors, who had believed in me and put their money into my vision. And my family, who had supported me even when I was putting in 100-hour weeks. They had all believed in me, but I couldn't give them what they expected. I couldn't give them success. For months, I avoided talking about the company. Every time someone asked, I would offer vague answers, changing the subject as quickly as possible. It wasn't just about the company anymore, though. It was about me, too. I had failed. And the thought of facing that failure, of confronting it head-on, was more than I could handle. But then one day, my mother called. I hadn't spoken to her in years. Our relationship had always been strained, ever since I left home to chase my dreams and never really looked back. She was always there, but I never reached out, not until that moment. I was shocked when I saw her name on the caller ID. We hadn't spoken in ages, and the last time we did, it was under uncomfortable circumstances. I wasn't sure why she was calling, but something inside of me told me I couldn't ignore it. I picked up the phone. Her voice was soft, but I could tell she had something on her mind. She told me that she had been following the company's progress, though I had never told her much about it. She had heard about the struggles I was facing, and she wanted to help. At first, I was resistant. I didn't want to accept anything from her, not after all these years. I thought I could do it alone. But she insisted, telling me that she had been thinking about me, and she knew how hard it must be. She said, "I've always believed in you, even when you didn't believe in yourself. I want to help you get back on your feet. I want to make sure that you don't give up on your dreams just because you've hit a bump in the road." I didn't understand what she meant by helping. I thought she was just being kind, offering words of encouragement. But the next few days brought something unexpected. When I arrived at the office the following Monday, the first thing I noticed was the large envelope on my desk. Inside it, I found documents I couldn't quite believe. My mother, the woman I had barely spoken to for years, had bought a 50% stake in the company. She had used her own savings to invest in the business, enough to take control of half of what I had built. I was shocked. How could she have done this? How could she have come back into my life like this, out of nowhere, and taken such a significant role in something that was mine to begin with? But as I looked at the documents again, I realized something. She wasn't trying to take over. She wasn't trying to replace me. She was doing what I couldn't do for myself. She was stepping in when I was too defeated to see the way forward. She had come to help me get back what I had lost, and more importantly, to help me believe in myself again. As much as it hurt, I knew I had to accept her offer. There was no other way out. I needed her help. More than that, I needed her presence. She was giving me a second chance, a chance to prove to myself that I could still make something of this. But I couldn't shake the feeling of inadequacy. Was I really ready to take the reins again? Could I rise from the ashes of my own failure? I wasn't sure, but I had to try. And so, with a heavy heart and a renewed sense of purpose, I stepped into the unknown again, this time with my mother by my side, and a small but powerful glimmer of hope in my heart. The days following my mother's return to the company were a blur. I had tried to stay detached from the overwhelming emotions swirling inside me, but it was impossible. Every time I walked into the office, I was reminded of what had once been mine and what it had become. The familiar faces of employees, the familiar hum of the office, and even the buzzing of the phones felt like echoes of a past life, one where I was in control, where I was the one making the decisions. Now everything was different. The first time I walked into the boardroom after my mother's investment, I felt the weight of the room shift. It was no longer just my company, it was ours, and with that ownership came a new set of responsibilities that felt even heavier than before. I could no longer operate like I had in the past. Gone were the days when I could make rash decisions on a whim, driven by passion and optimism. Now I had to be methodical, calculated, and most of all, I had to prove to myself and to everyone around me that I was capable of leading this company back to where it was supposed to be. It was hard, so hard. Every decision felt like a test, and every misstep was a reminder of how far I had fallen. I couldn't help but replay the past in my mind, constantly revisiting the mistakes I had made, the things I had overlooked. The memories of the late nights spent alone in my office, worrying about how to keep the business afloat, haunted me. I couldn't escape the guilt that clung to me, a constant reminder that I had failed at the very thing that had once been my dream. But my mother was relentless in her support. She had a calmness about her, a quiet strength that I admired but also resented. I couldn't understand why she was doing this. She had everything she needed already. Why invest in something that wasn't even hers? But I began to see that her involvement wasn't just about the money. It was about believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. It was about giving me the push I needed, even if I didn't ask for it. I wasn't sure I could handle it. I wasn't sure I was worthy of the trust she had placed in me. There were times when I wanted to walk away from it all, to quit and start fresh. But I couldn't. I had too much pride. And I had too much at stake now, not just for myself, but for the people who still depended on me. The company was struggling. No matter how hard we tried, we couldn't seem to pull ahead. We were in a constant state of flux, trying to adjust to the market, adapting to new trends, and yet the results were always just out of reach. I could feel the pressure mounting. Everyone was watching, waiting for the next move, and all I could do was try to make decisions that wouldn't make things worse. There were days when I felt like I was drowning. The meetings, the paperwork, the constant cycle of strategy and analysis, it was never-ending. I was so caught up in the minutiae of running the business that I had forgotten why I started it in the first place. I had lost touch with the vision, with the passion that had driven me to build it all from scratch. Then one night, when the office was empty and the silence felt deafening, I sat alone at my desk, staring out the window at the city lights. The cold glow of the fluorescent lights above me felt harsh, unwelcoming, but I couldn't leave. Not yet. I wasn't ready to give up. It was in that moment that I realized something important. I had been so focused on the failures, the mistakes, the things that had gone wrong, that I had forgotten to look at how far I had come. Yes, the company was struggling, but it wasn't gone. It was still here, still fighting. And so was I. I had the chance to fix things, to rebuild, to find a new path forward. It wasn't going to be easy, but nothing worth having ever is. I spent the rest of the night going over the numbers, the reports, and the data. There were signs of hope, small victories that had been overshadowed by the bigger challenges. But they were there. I just had to see them. I made a plan. A new strategy, one that would focus on the strengths we had rather than the weaknesses. It wasn't going to be a quick fix, but it was a start. The next morning, I walked into the office with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control again. It wasn't perfect, but it was something, and something was better than nothing. But even as I began to find my footing, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that I was being watched. Not just by the employees or investors, but by my mother. She was always there, always observing, always offering her guidance, whether I wanted it or not. I knew she meant well, but there were times when her presence felt suffocating. I wanted to prove to myself that I could do this on my own, without relying on her. Yet I couldn't escape the truth. I needed her. More than I wanted to admit, I needed her experience, her wisdom, and yes, her financial backing. Without her, I would have already lost everything. But I also realized that I couldn't stay in her shadow forever. I had to find my own way. I had to step up and be the leader I had always imagined myself to be. The pressure was immense. Every decision I made carried weight, and every misstep could have catastrophic consequences. But there was no turning back now. I couldn't give up. I wouldn't give up. For my mother, for my employees, for myself, I had to find a way to make this work. And so I pushed forward, one step at a time, one decision at a time. I took on the responsibilities of the CEO, trying to learn from the mistakes of the past while moving forward with a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't easy. Every day felt like a battle, but I had to keep going, because if I didn't, everything I had worked for would have been for nothing. Looking back now, I realize how far I've come since that moment of despair, but I also know that the road ahead is long. There will be more challenges, more obstacles to overcome, but I'm ready, and this time I'm not alone. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly, and with every passing day, the pressure mounted. I had thought that when my mother decided to invest in the company, I would finally feel a sense of relief. Instead, I found myself overwhelmed by the weight of expectations. Expectations from my employees, my investors, and most crushing of all, from my mother. She was there every step of the way, her watchful eyes constantly assessing whether I was making the right choices. I had asked for her help, and now I had to prove that I was worthy of it. At first, I welcomed her advice. She had been in the business world long before I had, and she had a wealth of knowledge that I was only beginning to understand. But as time wore on, I started to feel a growing sense of frustration. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was questioning every decision I made. I had been the one running the show for years, and suddenly I felt like I was being treated like an inexperienced child who couldn't manage anything on his own. She would sit in the meetings, her presence looming over me, and I could see the subtle shift in her demeanor when things weren't going according to plan. She would give me that look, the one that said, "I told you so." It was enough to make me second-guess myself, to doubt every decision I had made. But I couldn't show that. I couldn't let anyone see my insecurities, not in front of the team. I had to act like I had everything under control, even when I didn't. I had to be the leader, the person everyone looked to for answers. But inside, I was crumbling. Every day felt like a battle against my own doubts, and I couldn't escape the feeling that I wasn't enough. I had tried so hard to distance myself from the failures of the past. The bankruptcy, the investors pulling out, the board meetings where I sat, helpless, as the company I had worked so hard to build slipped through my fingers. Those memories haunted me every time I made a decision. I feared that I would repeat the same mistakes, that I would let everyone down once again. The board meetings were the hardest. I had to present reports, updates, and projections that painted a picture of a company on the rise, even when the reality was far from it. I had to talk about new partnerships, new ideas, and growth strategies, even though I wasn't sure any of it would work. The pressure to keep up the facade was suffocating, and every time I left those meetings, I felt more and more disconnected from the person I had once been. I wasn't the passionate entrepreneur anymore. I was a manager trying to keep things together, pretending like I knew what I was doing. I knew my employees could sense it. They were used to my energy, my drive, my optimism. But now I felt like a shell of that person. The weight of my past mistakes was holding me back, and I couldn't seem to shake it off. I watched as they looked at me with uncertainty, waiting for me to show them the way forward, and I felt an overwhelming guilt. I had promised them stability, success, a future. But what was I giving them now? I was giving them fear and uncertainty, and I hated myself for it. One evening, after a particularly grueling board meeting, I sat alone in my office, staring out at the city lights. The office was quiet, the only sound the hum of the air conditioning. I felt like I was in a vacuum, detached from everything around me. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to release all the frustration that had been building up inside me for months. But I couldn't. I had to hold it together. The door creaked open, and I looked up to see my mother standing in the doorway. She had a soft smile on her face, but I could see the concern in her eyes. I didn't want to talk to her. I didn't want her to see how much I was struggling. But she stepped into the room anyway, closing the door behind her. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice gentle but laced with that knowing tone. I could feel my chest tighten. "Yeah, just another tough meeting." She didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there watching me. I could feel her eyes on me, her presence steady and unwavering. It was both comforting and suffocating at the same time. Finally, she spoke again. "You're trying too hard to do this on your own, aren't you?" she asked, her voice soft but piercing. I didn't answer at first. I couldn't. The truth was, I didn't know how to let anyone in anymore. I had spent so much of my life pushing everyone away, thinking I had to do it all myself. I had built the company from nothing, and I didn't want to admit that I needed help. I didn't want to admit that I had failed. "I'm fine," I said, the words feeling hollow even as they left my mouth. She didn't buy it. "You don't have to carry all of this alone, you know. You're not a failure just because things aren't going as planned. This is a setback, not the end." Her words were a balm to my wounds, but I couldn't let myself believe them. Not yet. I had failed before, and I had promised myself I wouldn't fail again. But here I was, struggling with every decision, questioning every move, and feeling like I was just one step away from losing everything. "I just don't know if I'm cut out for this anymore," I confessed, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "I don't know if I can do it again, if I can pull it off. I'm not the same person I was when I started this. I feel like I'm pretending, and I don't know how much longer I can keep up the act." She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes searching mine. "You don't have to be perfect, son. You don't have to have all the answers, you just have to keep going, and sometimes it's okay to ask for help." The silence stretched between us, heavy and filled with unspoken words. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't alone in this. Maybe I didn't have to carry the weight of the company on my shoulders by myself. In that moment, I made a decision. I had been so focused on proving that I could do it on my own that I had forgotten the one thing that had always mattered to me: my family. My mother had always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. And she was right. I didn't have to carry the burden alone. I had people who cared about me, who wanted to see me succeed. And together, we could find a way to turn this company around. But it wasn't going to happen overnight. I had to be patient, not just with the company, but with myself. I had to accept that I couldn't do it all, that I didn't have all the answers. But I had a team, I had my mother, and most importantly, I had my own resilience. I just needed to believe in it again. As I sat there looking at my mother, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was enough. Enough to remind me why I started this journey in the first place. to remind me that failure wasn't the end. It was just another step in the process of rebuilding, of growing, of finding strength in the face of adversity. And I was ready to take that step. I had always thought that success was something you could chase, something that once you caught it would never let you go. But now I was beginning to understand that success wasn't a static destination. It wasn't a trophy you could place on a shelf and admire. It was a journey, one full of twists, turns, and obstacles. There were days when you felt on top of the world, and others when you felt like you were sinking beneath the weight of your own choices. And no matter how hard you tried to control it, life kept pushing you in directions you hadn't planned. That's the realization I had while sitting alone in my office one evening. I had been working tirelessly for weeks, trying to put together a new business plan, trying to figure out the next big move for the company. But the harder I worked, the more it seemed like I was chasing my own tail. The numbers weren't adding up, the plans didn't make sense, and the vision I had once held so clearly in my mind was now clouded with doubt. I had been trying to do everything on my own again. My mother had offered her help, her guidance, her financial backing, and I had pushed her away. Not deliberately, but I had convinced myself that I was capable of handling it all by myself. The pride I had in myself, in my ability to build something from the ground up, made me blind to the truth. I wasn't invincible, and I couldn't do it alone. Sitting there, staring at the reports, I had an epiphany. It wasn't about doing it all myself. It wasn't about proving I was worthy of my mother's trust or the company's success. It was about accepting help when I needed it, learning to trust the people who believed in me, and not being afraid to rely on the support of others. I wasn't weak for asking for help. I was strong for recognizing when I couldn't do it alone. That moment of clarity was the turning point. I realized I had been so focused on proving myself that I had forgotten to trust myself. I had been second-guessing every move I made, always afraid of failure, and in doing so, I had paralyzed myself. The company wasn't just my responsibility. It was the responsibility of everyone who believed in it, in me, and that included my mother. The next morning, I walked into the office with a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't going to pretend anymore. I wasn't going to hide my doubts. I wasn't going to bury my fear beneath a facade of confidence. I was going to face everything head-on, accept help where I needed it, and lead with a clear vision. I called a meeting with my team. They had been working tirelessly, giving everything they had to the company, but I knew they were starting to feel the same doubts I had been carrying. The energy in the room had shifted. It was no longer the vibrant, optimistic environment I had once fostered. It had become a space filled with uncertainty, with people questioning their roles and wondering if this was really the right path. I couldn't let that continue. I couldn't let them feel like I wasn't leading them in the right direction. As I looked around the room, I realized something important. They didn't need me to be perfect. They didn't need me to have all the answers. They needed me to be real, to admit that things weren't going as planned, to acknowledge that the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. But most importantly, they needed me to believe in them as much as I believed in myself. They needed me to trust that together we could find a way forward. I took a deep breath before speaking. I know things haven't been easy lately. I know we've been struggling, and I know you've all been putting in the hard work. But I want to be honest with you. I don't have all the answers. I don't have a perfect plan, and I can't promise you that everything is going to turn around overnight. But what I can promise you is that I'm not giving up, and I'm not going to ask you to give up either. There was a moment of silence, and then, slowly, I saw the faces of my team shift. They weren't looking at me with the same skepticism they had before. Instead, they were looking at me with something else, hope. It wasn't a grand gesture or a speech that changed things. It was my honesty, my willingness to admit that I didn't have everything figured out, but I was still willing to fight for the company, for them, and for myself. The next few weeks were some of the hardest I had ever faced. Every day was a struggle, but we worked together. We didn't always get it right, but we kept pushing forward. Slowly but surely, things started to shift. The small wins, the progress we made in the right direction, it all started to add up. The numbers weren't spectacular, but they were moving in the right direction. I still had my doubts, of course. There were nights when I lay awake, wondering if I was making the right decisions, wondering if the company would really make it. But there was one thing I never doubted anymore, my ability to keep going. I wasn't afraid to fail anymore. I had learned that failure wasn't the end, it was a part of the journey. One day, about a month after that pivotal meeting, I sat in my office, looking out at the city skyline. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. The company was still far from where I wanted it to be, but it was moving forward, and I was moving forward with it. I realized then that my mother had been right all along. I didn't have to do it alone. I could lean on her, on my team, on the people who believed in me. And together, we would build something stronger than before. That moment of clarity changed everything. It didn't make the road ahead easier, but it made me realize that I didn't have to walk it alone. And that was enough to give me the strength to keep moving forward. I had been holding on, barely keeping my grip on everything. The company, the expectations, the endless work. It felt like walking on a tightrope, where one misstep could send everything crashing down. But there was something different now. Something in me had shifted, and I felt a flicker of hope where before there was only doubt. I spent countless hours in the office, reviewing numbers, talking to employees, and making decisions. Every task felt monumental, as though every small step had the potential to either lift us higher or drag us deeper into failure. I had become hyper-aware of every move I made, second-guessing myself with every decision. But as the days went on, I realized that this new level of scrutiny wasn't necessarily bad. It kept me sharp, it kept me focused. There were moments when I would walk through the office late at night, watching the lights flicker in the empty rooms, the hum of the computers still alive in the stillness. It reminded me of where we had been just months before, the desperate moments when I thought it was all over. But now, there was a tangible difference. We were no longer in freefall. We had started to stabilize. Slowly, we were regaining the ground we had lost. Still, I wasn't satisfied. I knew we had a long way to go. The recovery wasn't instantaneous, and I couldn't afford to rest on our small successes. We had built a foundation, yes, but it was fragile. It was still uncertain. But I wasn't going to let that stop me. I had come too far to back down now. In one of my late-night sessions, I found myself staring at the company's latest quarterly report. The numbers were still far from ideal, but there were signs of improvement. It wasn't perfect, but it was something to build on. And that's when it hit me, this wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about me. I wasn't just trying to rebuild the business, I was rebuilding myself. I had spent so much of my time hiding behind my role as CEO, hiding behind the expectations I thought others had for me, that I had forgotten who I was. I had let the pressure of success, or the fear of failure, define me, and in doing so, I had become disconnected from the very reason I started this journey. I wasn't just trying to prove something to my investors or my employees. I was trying to prove something to myself. I had always believed that success was the ultimate validation. But now, I realized that it wasn't about the destination, it was about the process. The lessons I had learned, the strength I had discovered in myself, and the relationships I had built along the way were what truly mattered. The company could fail, but I couldn't. I had to keep going for myself. That thought was liberating. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was on the right path, even if it wasn't the path I had envisioned. The uncertainty still loomed, but it no longer paralyzed me. I had found peace in the chaos, and that, I realized, was the key to moving forward. One evening, as I was sitting at my desk, reviewing some new partnership opportunities, my mother walked in. She had always been a calming presence, even when things were at their most chaotic. She had that quiet strength about her, the kind that seemed unshakable. But tonight, she didn't look like the woman who had once guided me through every challenge. Tonight, she looked tired. I could see it in her eyes. The worry, the exhaustion, she had been carrying the weight of this company just as much as I had. But unlike me, she didn't hide it. She faced it head-on, without complaint, without hesitation. "You look worn out," I said, pushing away the papers in front of me. "Everything okay?" She hesitated for a moment, her gaze fixed on the floor. Then she looked up at me, and I saw something I hadn't seen before, a vulnerability. A rawness. For the first time, she didn't seem like the indomitable force I had always seen her as. She seemed human. I'm tired, she said quietly. I've been doing this for a long time and I know that it's not easy, but I want you to know something. You're doing better than you think. You've come so far and I'm proud of you. The words hit me harder than I expected. I had always sought her approval, always wanted her to see me as capable, as strong. But now, in this moment, I realized that I wasn't just doing this for her or for anyone else. I was doing this for me. I don't feel like I'm doing enough, I admitted. I feel like I'm always falling short, always playing catch-up. There's so much more to do. She sat down beside me, her hand resting on my shoulder. You're never going to feel like you've done enough. There's always more to do, but what matters is that you keep going, you keep fighting, and you don't give up. That's what makes you strong, not perfection, not the numbers, you. I felt a lump in my throat. It wasn't often that she spoke to me like this, so open, so raw. It was like she was giving me permission to let go of the impossible standards I had set for myself. She was telling me that I didn't have to be perfect, I just had to keep going. And for the first time, I truly understood what she meant. The weight I had been carrying, of trying to prove myself, of living up to expectations, wasn't mine to carry anymore. It was okay to be vulnerable. It was okay to ask for help. It was okay to admit that I didn't have all the answers. As long as I kept moving forward, that was all that mattered. The next day, I woke up with a sense of clarity I hadn't had in years. I was no longer afraid of failure. I was no longer afraid of what others thought of me. I had learned to accept that the journey wasn't going to be smooth. There would be setbacks, mistakes, and moments of doubt, but that was all part of the process, and I was ready to embrace it. I walked into the office with a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't just the CEO of a struggling company. I was a man who had faced his fears, who had fought through his doubts, and who had come out stronger on the other side. And I wasn't going to stop. Not now, not ever. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure. I was ready for whatever came next. There comes a time when you stop looking over your shoulder and start focusing on the path ahead. I had spent so many months, and even years, haunted by the ghosts of past mistakes. I had wondered if I was worthy of success, if I could recover what I had lost. But now, as I sat at my desk, looking out the window at the bustling city below, I realized something important. I had already taken the most important step. The journey to get here had not been easy. It had been filled with moments of doubt, fear, and failure. But each of those moments had taught me something. Each setback, each hard lesson, had shaped me into the person I was today. The person who no longer feared failure, but instead embraced it as part of the process. I had rebuilt the company. Not alone, but with the help of my team and the support of my mother. It wasn't perfect, but nothing ever is. What mattered was that we were still here. And more than that, we were stronger than before. The office had changed, too. It was no longer just a place where people came to work. It had become a space where ideas were born, where collaboration flourished, and where every single person was invested in the success of the company. It wasn't just mine anymore, it was ours, and that was something I had to come to terms with. My ego had always been tied to ownership, to being the one in control. But now I understood that true leadership wasn't about holding on to power, it was about sharing it. About trusting others to help you achieve something greater than you could on your own. But even though the company was moving forward, I was still faced with the task of rebuilding my own sense of self. I had spent so much time focusing on the business, trying to make it succeed, that I had neglected myself. I had ignored my own needs, my own happiness. The last few years had been a blur of work, worry, and stress. I had forgotten what it meant to take care of myself, to invest in my own growth. It was time for a change. I had to start taking better care of myself, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally as well. I had to remember that I was more than just the CEO of a company. I was a person with dreams, with passions, and with the ability to shape my own future. And if I wanted to continue growing the business, I had to make sure I was growing too. I began setting boundaries. I started saying no to things that drained me, to commitments that didn't align with my values. I made time for the things that brought me joy, whether it was a quiet morning walk, reading a book, or spending time with friends. I reconnected with the things that had once fueled my passion. and I started to feel the weight lifting from my shoulders, the tension in my chest easing. The more I focused on my own well-being, the more I noticed a shift in the company. When I was in a better place, I made better decisions. I was more present, more engaged, and more able to lead with clarity and purpose. I was no longer just reacting to the pressures of the business. I was proactively shaping its future, and that made all the difference. As the weeks went by, the company continued to grow. We secured new contracts, expanded our reach, and started to build a reputation as a trusted leader in our industry. The work we were doing mattered. It wasn't just about the bottom line anymore. It was about making a real impact, about creating something that would outlast all of us. And that in itself was enough to fuel my passion. But no matter how much progress we made, there were still days when the self-doubt crept in. The old habits died hard. There were still moments when I questioned myself, when I wondered if I was truly capable of leading this company to the heights I had dreamed of. The fear of failure had always been a constant companion, but now it felt more like a shadow I could see, but no longer feared. I knew that I was going to face challenges. The world was unpredictable, and the road ahead would never be smooth. But I also knew something important. I wasn't alone anymore. I had a team who believed in me, who trusted me, and who was willing to fight with me every step of the way. I had a mother who had been there through it all, offering her unwavering support, and I had learned to trust her guidance without feeling threatened by it. I had learned the power of humility. I had learned to ask for help, to lean on the people around me. It was no longer about proving myself. It was about leading with integrity, with compassion, and with a sense of shared purpose. It was about creating something that was bigger than me. And as I stood in the office that morning, looking around at the people who had become my family, I realized that I had found my true purpose. It wasn't just about business. It wasn't just about success. It was about building something meaningful, something that would make a difference, and that was enough. I picked up the phone and called a few of the team leaders. We had a meeting scheduled to discuss a new project, but today I wanted it to be different. Today I wanted to talk about our vision for the future. I wanted to hear their ideas, their dreams, and what they saw for the company. As we sat around the table, I listened to their voices, their excitement, and their passion. It was clear that they had bought into the vision of the company, but more than that, they had bought into me. They believed in the direction we were headed. They believed in the values we were building the company on: collaboration, integrity, and impact. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace. This was it. This was what I had been working toward. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but I was ready for them. I wasn't just the leader of this company, I was a part of it. I was part of something bigger than myself. As the meeting ended, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The weight of the past was still there, but it no longer defined me. I had learned from it, grown from it, and I was ready to face whatever came next. The company wasn't just mine anymore. It was ours, and together we were going to build something incredible.